My boss asked me to stay for this after hours in the break room. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as I finished up my last few tasks of the day. The office was quiet, with the usual end-of-day lulls settling over the cubicles. Just the faint clatter of someone's keyboard down the hall and the hum of the coffee machine a few feet away. Everyone had left except for a handful of people, and of course my boss, who never seemed to call it a day on time. Mr. Harding, as he was known around the office, was the kind of man who expected everyone to stay a little longer just because he did, as though his commitment to his job had to be contagious. His reputation in the company was somewhere between respect and fear, a man who rarely smiled, often carried the weight of authority, and yet never pushed anyone too far. Tonight was different, though. I'd been caught up in a particularly grueling report when he'd stopped by my desk, a stern yet curious look on his face. His words, though ordinary, held a note I couldn't quite place. "Rachel, would you mind staying back a little longer tonight?" His eyes had met mine, steady and unreadable, leaving me with no clear answer. Now, here I was, alone in the break room, sipping on a stale cup of coffee. The chill in the air was just enough to send a shiver down my spine. A shadow passed over the doorway, and I looked up to see him entering the room, his usual composed demeanor softened slightly by an unusual expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Thank you for staying," he said, his voice even but edged with something deeper. "I know you probably had plans." I shook my head, trying to keep my tone light. "No, it's fine. I'm not in any rush." He moved a little closer, standing beside me as he poured himself a cup of coffee. For a few moments, there was only silence, the faint clink of his spoon stirring his drink. He looked at me again, this time with a trace of warmth in his gaze. "You've been doing good work, Rachel. I don't say it enough." "Thank you," I replied, my face warming under his gaze. Compliments were rare from him. He was the type to expect perfection and save his praise for those he deemed truly deserving. For a second, I felt an odd sense of pride, followed by a flicker of something else, something I didn't want to examine too closely. As he settled against the counter, a comfortable silence fell between us, an unspoken understanding filling the space. We shared a quiet moment that felt like it was just ours. I watched him take a sip of his coffee, the faint lines around his eyes softening, giving him a gentler look than he usually wore. There was something about the way he looked at me tonight that made my heart beat just a little faster, an unexpected thrill that caught me off guard. "You know, I don't really get to talk to people much around here," he said, his tone unexpectedly candid. "Not like this." I tilted my head, intrigued. "You're usually so professional." "Some things require a level of detachment," he murmured, looking down at his cup. "But sometimes I wonder if I've overdone it." He looked back up, his gaze meeting mine in a way that made me feel like we were the only two people in the world at that moment. I felt a sudden warmth spread through me, the kind that crept up your spine and lingered there, making every breath feel heavy and charged. We stayed like that, neither of us moving, just watching each other, suspended in a fragile moment that felt like it could shatter at the slightest touch. And then he took a step closer. It was subtle, but enough that I could feel his presence even more strongly. My pulse quickened, and I hoped he couldn't hear it. There was a tension building, something silent and unspoken weaving between us, something neither of us seemed willing to break. "Rachel," he said softly, almost to himself, as if testing the sound of my name on his lips. The sound sent a thrill through me, unexpected and thrilling. "Yes." My voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would break whatever spell we had unwittingly cast over ourselves. His eyes held mine, a subtle intensity simmering just beneath the surface. "Sometimes," he began, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite identify, "I wonder if I've missed out on too much." His words hung in the air, suspended between us, laden with a depth that surprised me. It was a confession, one wrapped in mystery, and I didn't quite know how to respond. Instead, I found myself taking a step closer, drawn to the warmth of his gaze, the vulnerability in his expression. "Maybe," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "it's not too late." Our eyes locked, and for a brief moment, The world around us seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us in that small, dimly lit break room. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, each of us waiting for the other to make the next move, neither of us quite daring to cross that invisible line. But there was something undeniable in his gaze, a spark that made me want to take a step closer, to close the distance that lingered between us. My hand brushed against the counter, fingertips inches from his, and I held my breath, wondering if he'd reach out, if he'd bridge that gap. He hesitated, his gaze flicking to where my hand rested, as if he, too, was weighing the consequences of what would happen if he crossed that invisible boundary. And then, in one swift, unexpected motion, he closed the distance between us, his fingers gently brushing against mine. It was a simple touch, but it sent a shockwave through me, setting every nerve ablaze. The break room, with its stale coffee and muted lights, faded into the background as we stood there, our fingers entwined, suspended in a moment that felt both innocent and charged. He looked down at our hands, his thumb lightly tracing the curve of my knuckles, and a small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. It was the kind of smile you barely noticed but couldn't ignore, the kind that hinted at thoughts unspoken, desires carefully kept at bay. I could feel my heart racing, every beat loud in the silence that enveloped us. There was a part of me that wanted to pull back, to break the tension that had built between us, but another part, a part that had lingered in the back of my mind, ignored but never forgotten, wanted to see where this would go, to let the moment unfold naturally, consequences be damned. We stood like that, hands barely touching, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the room, each second stretching longer than the last. And then he looked up, his gaze meeting mine, and in that instant, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft but steady, a quiet intensity in his eyes that sent another shiver down my spine. "Yes," I whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. His gaze held mine, and the tension between us became almost unbearable. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one louder than the last, but none of them able to drown out the steady, electrifying presence of his hand on mine. "It's strange," he murmured, his voice soft, almost like he was talking more to himself than to me. "I never thought I'd find myself here, like this." "Neither did I replied, barely able to manage more than a whisper. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning neither of us dared to voice out loud. His thumb moved gently, tracing slow, lingering patterns across the back of my hand, and I felt every movement like a spark igniting along my skin. He took a breath, steadying himself, his gaze dropping back down to where our hands touched as though even he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "I've always respected you," he said finally, his voice low and laced with a hint of vulnerability. "But tonight feels different." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words sink in, each one sending a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. "It does," I managed, feeling an inexplicable courage rising within me. "It feels like we're crossing a line we can't uncross." There it was, the truth laid bare between us, a truth that had lingered in glances, in gestures, but never spoken. I felt my breath catch as he nodded slowly, his eyes darkening, his jaw tense. "There are always lines, Rachel," he said, his voice rougher now, the words coming out as though they were dredged up from somewhere deep within him. "Lines we draw to keep ourselves safe. But what if some of those lines keep us from what we want?" The vulnerability in his voice, the quiet, unspoken longing, made something in me tremble. I knew we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't return from, yet a part of me ached to dive in headfirst, to see where this would take us, regardless of the consequences. I shifted closer, and the air between us grew even more charged, thick and almost tangible, pulsing with an energy that neither of us seemed able to resist. I could feel the warmth of his body, his presence enveloping me, drawing me in. His hand tightened slightly around mine, a silent signal, a question waiting for an answer. He was so close now that I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and steady, stirring something deep inside me. My mind screamed caution, but my heart thudded with anticipation, with a raw, thrilling intensity that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but it sent a shiver down my spine, every syllable heavy with intent. "Yes," I replied, breathless, unable to look away from his eyes, which held me captive, pulling me further into the uncharted depths we'd begun to explore together. "Are you sure you want this?" His question lingered in the air, a delicate invitation balanced on the edge of what was acceptable, tempting us both. The logical part of my mind was screaming at me to walk away, to retreat from the line we were inching ever closer to crossing. But logic had long since taken a back seat, drowned out by the thrum of my heartbeat, by the warmth of his hand, by the magnetic pull that kept us close. I murmured, barely able to contain the tremor in my voice. I've wanted this for a while." The admission hung between us, fragile yet undeniable, and I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, followed by something else, something deeper, something raw. Slowly, he reached up, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering at my cheek, warm and gentle. The world seemed to narrow to just that single point of contact, the warmth of his skin against mine, the way his touch seemed to ignite every nerve ending, leaving me acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat. "I don't know what this means," he whispered, his voice thick with the same uncertainty, the same conflict I felt twisting within me. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything," I replied softly, and I watched as his expression shifted, his gaze softening, a faint hint of relief there, as if the thought of letting go, of simply being in the moment without overthinking, was something he desperately needed. His hand moved from my cheek, tracing down to my shoulder, his touch feather-light but potent enough to send a thrill through me. My skin burned where his fingers lingered, and the air between us grew even more charged, thick with a tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. And then, with a quiet determination that took my breath away, he leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He paused, his gaze meeting mine, searching, waiting for that final signal. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, my lips meeting his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative and careful, as if we were both afraid to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. But it didn't take long for the intensity to build, for the restraint to melt away, replaced by something deeper, more desperate, more real. His arms slipped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt myself sinking into him, surrendering to the warmth and strength of his embrace. Every inch of me was alive, every sense heightened, as though the entire world had faded away, leaving just the two of us locked in this forbidden, undeniable connection. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, each touch, each brush of his lips igniting a fire within me that I hadn't known was there. My hands found their way to his shoulders, and I clung to him, feeling the solidness of him beneath my fingertips, grounding me even as my heart raced and my mind spun. We pulled apart, breathing heavily, his forehead resting against mine as we both tried to catch our breath, to steady ourselves in the aftermath of what we had just shared. His hand found mine again, fingers intertwining, and the simple gesture felt as intimate as the kiss we'd just shared, grounding us in the reality of what had just happened. What now?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, my heart still pounding, every inch of me still buzzing with the remnants of his touch. He looked at me, his expression softened by an emotion I couldn't quite place. There was a quiet intensity there, a lingering vulnerability that made me ache for him, for whatever it was that had brought us to this point. "We take it one step at a time," he said softly, his fingers brushing gently over mine. "No rush, no expectations. Just let this be what it is." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my chest, a calm settling over me as I allowed myself to sink into the warmth of his presence, to let the moment unfold without the pressure of answers or definitions. It felt freeing, as though we'd stumbled upon something precious, something that existed outside of words and explanations. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's presence, savoring the quiet intimacy, the simple joy of being close. It felt like the start of something new, something neither of us fully understood but both seemed willing to explore, no matter where it might lead. And as we stood there in the quiet of the break room, fingers entwined and hearts racing, I knew that whatever happened next, this moment, this connection, would be one that neither of us would ever forget. Rachel, his voice broke through the silence, and he looked at me with a question in his eyes, as if asking for permission, for reassurance. I met his gaze, feeling a quiet, steady confidence within me, and I nodded, giving him the silent answer he sought. He exhaled, a subtle release of tension, and I felt the weight of the moment settle deeper around us. The edges of his lips curved into a faint smile, one that held a mix of relief, anticipation, and something deeper. He reached up, his hand grazing my cheek, his touch soft and lingering, as if he was savoring every detail, every sensation. For a moment, the break room faded away, and it was just the two of us, locked in a silent exchange that spoke more than words ever could. I felt myself drawn to him, closer still, every breath, every heartbeat echoing the unspoken connection we shared. His fingers slid from my cheek to the back of my neck, drawing me in until our foreheads rested against each other. The warmth radiating from him filled the space between us, closing the gap and bridging any hesitations that might have lingered. And then, he kissed me again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if we had all the time in the world. His hands cradled my face, and I melted into the kiss, my arms wrapping around his shoulders, pulling him closer. I felt the strength of his hold, the unyielding press of his body against mine, and I let myself be swept away, every thought fading until there was only him. We broke apart, but he didn't let go. Instead, he held me there, his gaze roaming over my face, his eyes dark and intense. His fingers traced along my jaw, lingering as though he wanted to memorize every line, every contour. "It's strange," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, "how something so unexpected can feel so right." I nodded, unable to speak, my voice caught somewhere in my throat. He tilted his head, his expression shifting from intense to gentle, as though he understood every emotion running through me. And in that moment, he was no longer my boss. He was just a man whose touch sent sparks through my skin, whose presence filled the room, making everything else seem small and inconsequential. Without thinking, I reached up, my fingers brushing his cheek, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath my fingertips. He closed his eyes at my touch, a small sigh escaping him, and when he opened them again, there was something raw there, something honest and vulnerable that made my heart ache. "Are you okay?" I whispered, my words barely audible. He nodded, his expression softening, but there was a weight in his gaze that told me there was more, something he wasn't saying, something he was holding back. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but I know I don't want it to end. Not now." I swallowed, feeling the intensity of his words sink in, each syllable echoing within me. I knew this was uncharted territory, a place where rules didn't apply and lines blurred, but I didn't care. Not anymore. "Then don't let it," I replied, my voice steady, and I saw the faintest hint of a smile tug at the corner of his lips, a silent promise. In a quiet, unspoken agreement, he took my hand, lacing his fingers with mine, and gently guided me toward the small sofa tucked away in the corner of the break room. We sank down together, close enough that our shoulders touched, our hands still intertwined, an unbroken connection that neither of us seemed willing to sever. We sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us, filling the space with an unspoken anticipation. His thumb brushed over the back of my hand, a gentle, rhythmic motion that sent a soft thrill through me with each pass. "Rachel," he said softly, and I turned to face him, my heart racing as I took in the expression on his face. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, his gaze filled with a mixture of wonder, warmth, and something deeper, something that made my chest tighten. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to where our hands were joined, and I could see the quiet struggle playing out behind his eyes, the silent battle between desire and restraint. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might pull away, that the weight of the situation might be too much. But then he looked up, his resolve hardening, and I felt his grip on my hand tighten, a silent reassurance that he was as committed to this as I was. Sometimes, he began, his voice thick with emotion, we make choices that define us. Choices we don't fully understand, but they feel right. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. This feels like one of those choices. I nodded, my throat tightening with the weight of his confession, and I reached out, my free hand resting on his arm, grounding him, grounding both of us. I understand, I said, and I did. I understood every unspoken word, every silent hesitation. We were on the edge of something irrevocable, something that defied logic and reason, yet felt more real than anything I had ever known. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm against my skin, and I felt a quiet calm settle over me, a sense of peace in the midst of the turmoil. There were no words for what we felt, no way to quantify or define it, but in that moment, words didn't matter. All that mattered was the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his touch, and the unbreakable bond we had forged in the quiet, stolen moments between responsibilities and restraint. Slowly, his hand rose to cup my face, his fingers tracing the curve of my cheek, and I felt my breath hitch as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, as though he was savoring every second. The kiss deepened, slow and unhurried, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the warmth, the quiet intimacy that surrounded us. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt a thrill race through me, a heady rush of emotion that made everything else fade away. We were lost in each other, wrapped in a cocoon of shared warmth, of unspoken promises and quiet revelations. His touch was gentle but insistent, a silent declaration of everything we had left unsaid, and I felt my heart swell, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, soft, open, vulnerable. His thumb brushed over my cheek, and I leaned into his touch, savoring the warmth, the quiet comfort that radiated from him. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, but I could hear the weight of emotion in his words. "I don't want to lose this." "You won't," I replied, my voice steady, and I meant it. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, I knew I wasn't willing to let it slip away. We sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence between us filled with a quiet understanding, a mutual resolve to hold onto this fragile connection we had found, no matter the cost. And as I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek, I knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, this moment, this connection, was worth every risk. For a while, we stayed in each other's embrace, savoring the calm that had settled over us, a peacefulness I hadn't known I'd been searching for. With every beat of his heart under my cheek, I felt my own heartbeat slowing, matching his rhythm, as though our pulses were harmonizing, joining in a quiet, unspoken promise. The break room around us seemed worlds away from the reality we would eventually have to face, and part of me wanted to stay in that pocket of time forever. Yet, even in the safety of his arms, a faint whisper of reality began to intrude, reminding me that soon we'd have to leave this room, to re-enter a world that didn't understand, a world that wouldn't allow what had blossomed between us. After a long, contemplative silence, he shifted slightly, his fingers tracing slow, soothing patterns along my shoulder, and I could feel the slight tension in his muscles, the same hesitancy that was beginning to coil inside me as the moment drew on. We couldn't stay here forever, and we both knew it. He drew in a deep breath, and I lifted my head, meeting his gaze. There was a mixture of tenderness and reluctance in his eyes, as though he, too, was grappling with the idea of stepping out of this fragile, intimate space we'd created. "I wish," he began, his voice soft, almost a murmur. He trailed off, a look of frustration passing over his face, and I could tell he was struggling to put into words the thoughts circling through his mind. "What is it?" I asked gently, my fingers brushing along the back of his hand, a small gesture of reassurance. He looked away, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wish I could take you away from here. Just somewhere no one knows us. Where we don't have to pretend or worry about anything but each other." The words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I hadn't realized until that moment just how much I'd longed for that same sense of freedom, that same escape. A place where the unspoken rules and boundaries of our lives wouldn't matter, where we could simply be, without fear of judgment or consequence. I nodded, feeling the weight of his confession settle over me like a warm, comforting blanket. "I wish for that too," I whispered, my voice thick with sincerity. Our eyes met, and in that shared gaze, I saw the same yearning, the same quiet desperation reflected back at me. It was a desire to hold onto this moment, to protect it from the prying eyes and harsh realities of the outside world. But I knew, deep down, that it was a dream, a fragile fantasy that couldn't survive in the harsh light of day. Slowly, reluctantly, he let his hand slip from mine, the warmth of his touch lingering even as he pulled back. It felt like a small loss, a quiet farewell to the safety and intimacy we'd shared, and I could see the same sadness mirrored in his eyes. "We should," he began, his voice trailing off as he glanced toward the door. There was a heaviness in his expression, a reluctance that echoed my own. "We should probably get back." The words were logical, practical, but they felt hollow, like an obligation we both dreaded. I nodded, swallowing back the ache that had begun to build in my chest. "You're right. It's probably for the best." We both stood, and he reached out, his hand brushing my shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance. I felt the warmth of his touch seep into me, grounding me, even as the distance between us grew. For a moment, we lingered, our eyes meeting in a silent exchange, a final, unspoken promise that we'd carry this moment with us, even as we returned to the confines of reality. And then, with a small, reluctant smile, he turned and began to make his way toward the door, his steps slow, as though each one took a conscious effort. I followed, my heart heavy with a bittersweet mixture of regret and gratitude. I didn't know what the future held for us, or if we'd ever find a way to reclaim the magic of this night, but I knew that whatever happened, I'd carry the memory of this moment, this connection, in my heart. As we reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the handle, and turned to look at me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity that took my breath away. "Rachel," he said softly, and I felt a shiver run through me at the sound of my name on his lips. He hesitated, his expression torn, as though he was weighing a final decision, a choice that could change everything. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my heart pounding in my chest. He took a deep breath, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might say something that would shatter the walls we'd carefully built around ourselves. But instead, he gave me a soft, almost wistful smile, a look that held 1,000 unspoken words, and finally, he opened the door. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the quiet hum of the building settling around us, a stark contrast to the warmth and intimacy of the break room. I felt a pang of loss as we stepped through the threshold, leaving behind the small sanctuary we'd shared, the fragile bubble of connection we'd created. As we walked down the hall, side by side yet separated by an invisible wall of propriety, I couldn't help but steal a glance at him, at the quiet strength and vulnerability that lingered in his gaze. I knew this was something neither of us had anticipated, something that defied explanation, but I also knew that, for better or worse, it was a part of us now. When we reached the elevator, he pressed the button, and we stood in silence, waiting, the soft ding of the arriving car breaking the stillness. As the door slid open, he gestured for me to enter first, his usual courtesy tinged with a warmth that made my heart ache. Inside, we stood shoulder to shoulder, close but not touching, the faint buzz of the elevator filling the silence. I felt the weight of his presence, the quiet intensity that seemed to wrap around us, binding us together in a way that went beyond words. As we reached my floor, he glanced at me, his eyes holding a question, a silent offer. I hesitated, feeling a surge of emotion well up within me, a mix of longing and sadness that left me momentarily breathless. "Good night, Rachel," he said softly, his voice filled with a warmth that seemed to linger, wrapping around me even as he stepped back, letting me exit the elevator alone. I turned to face him, my heart pounding, a part of me wanting to reach out, to bridge the distance one last time. But I knew, deep down, that this was where we had to part, that we each had our own lives, our own responsibilities waiting beyond the quiet intimacy of this moment. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my gaze lingering on his face, memorizing every detail, every line, before the doors slid shut. As I made my way down the empty corridor, my thoughts drifted back to the break room, to the warmth of his touch, the quiet intensity of his gaze. I knew that tonight would haunt me, that every glance, every touch, would play over and over in my mind, a reminder of what we'd shared, of what we'd left behind. When I finally reached my apartment, I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The weight of the night's events washed over me, and I felt a pang of longing, a bittersweet ache that filled the quiet spaces of my mind. I knew that what we'd shared was a fleeting moment, a connection that defied logic and reason, but I also knew that it was real, that it had left a mark on me that would never fade. And as I stood there, wrapped in the quiet solitude of my apartment, I allowed myself to remember, to hold on to the warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, the unspoken promises we'd exchanged. Tomorrow would bring the harsh light of reality, the weight of obligations and expectations, but tonight, I let myself feel, let myself remember, knowing that some connections, no matter how brief, are worth holding on to.